We can speak to the co-author of this report now, Save the Children's Head of Conflict and Humanitarian Policy. James Denslow joins us now via Skype. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. So looking specifically at that rise of children being involved and suffering from conflict, it seems to be that it's a rise in conflicts, but also perhaps this idea that children are now seen as more fair game in a lot of the facets of conflict itself.
Yes, I think that's a very fair description of it. I think we're seeing sort of the very notion of childhood and the protections that come with it at huge risk. And you went through a long list of very terrible statistics that the report speaks to, but ultimately these are all, of course, individual stories, and I think we shouldn't forget that. Sometimes the numbers are just too big for us to really get a handle on. But if we see from certain events like the death of Alan Kurdi, often it is the individual stories of children that really move people. But I think what this report does show is that almost 25 years since the UN agreed that the children armed conflict agenda was an issue of international security, countries really do need to get a grip and stop the war on children.
I mean, it seems that obviously reducing conflict would go a long way to easing this effect on children. But beyond that, in areas where that's just not realistic right now, what can be done to ease the burden that conflict places on children?
Well, I think there's a host of best practice effort, actually, if you're looking at sort of operational mechanisms and steps that states and non-state armed groups are taking to better protect children in conflict. You've got initiatives like the Safe Schools Declaration that don't add new international law to the pantheon, but rather show coalitions of the engaged and the concerned states and other actors to sort of really come up with practical ways of ensuring that schools aren't used by armed forces and groups and that teachers and students are protected. The Safe Schools Declaration's got over 110 signatories. So clearly there is a huge kind of constituency of concern out there. But I think the growth in non-state armed groups in particular and those that recruit children is really one of the key findings in this report, against the backdrop of not just more children living in high intensity conflict, but also more children being at risk of being recruited and the highest levels of recruitment ever recorded. So I do think we need to take a far better kind of effort looking into these parts of the world through different means, through new ways of doing things. And I think that's what this report calls for.
Without wanting to generalize, it seems obvious that a lot of these children will have gone through traumatic experiences that they will likely carry with them for the rest of their lives. How much of an effort is being made in dealing with the mental health of a lot of these children, especially when maybe they're removed from the original conflict zone, but maybe in refugee camps?
Well, I'd say not enough. I think we're still at the sort of tip of the iceberg in fully understanding what it is for children's mental health who've lived their entire lives. If you look at the long nature of conflicts like those in Afghanistan, Syria and Yemen, their entire lives living in conflict conditions with fight or flight, sort of hormones being constantly dumped into their brain rather than a safe place for them to creatively learn. So I think we've got a huge task on our hands, but at the same time, in my experience of seeing children in these parts of the world, there is an incredible level of resilience there. This isn't a lost generation. This is a huge opportunity for us as a planet. But I do think we need to realize that in the shadow of COVID, climate change and famine, there's almost been an invisibilization of children. They're just not being considered as front and center of these issues, when, of course, they are literally the future of our planet.
Especially, during the pandemic, because we're not really out of it yet, there was a sense of sometimes donation fatigue when it came to a lot of the conflicts around the world that are very difficult to solve. Because dealing with children is such an emotive issue, do you find that people react more to this kind of story?
Yes, I think there's a common denominator, to use a cliche, that we were all once children. I do think that sort of common sympathy towards children is being stretched by seeing children as threats, seeing them as you mentioned in your report, as potential soldiers or suicide bombers. And I think, again, especially for adolescent children, that's a huge problem. And it's why we need to make sure that peacekeeping operations have the right funding and that people know what they're doing when they're entering conflict zones with children all around them. So I think that is crucially important. But I think, our founder 100 plus years ago said that each generation of children allows mankind to sort of rebuild itself. And I think that's another opportunity here that we really do need to get a grip on.
Absolutely. It's a very difficult report to read, but one that absolutely should be read by as many people as possible. James Denslow, Save the Children's Head of Conflict and Humanitarian Policy. Sir, thank you for speaking to us.